At exactly midnight on September 18, 2022, under the shroud of darkness, an urgent call pierced through the quiet air of the local police station's command center. A strange, tense, and conflicting situation was unfolding in an isolated part of the city. The caller informed the police about a young woman who was refusing to leave her father's car, which had been parked for quite some time without any signs of movement. With their extensive experience, the officers quickly realized that this was not a straightforward case. A patrol unit was immediately dispatched to the scene to address the issue. When the officers arrived, they found a car parked by the side of the road. The interior lights were still on, casting a faint golden glow into the night's shadows. Everything around was eerily quiet, save for the soft rustling of the wind. Inside the car, the young woman sat motionless, her face tense, her vacant gaze fixed on the window. She showed no urgency, no signs of fear or anxiety. Occasionally, she would glance outside as if expecting someone, but there was no indication that she intended to leave. The officers cautiously approached the car, trying to assess the situation. One of them spoke gently but firmly, his tone professional yet patient. "Are you not planning to step out of the car?" The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lowered her head slightly, inching closer to the window as if attempting to organize her thoughts. Finally, she replied in a calm, almost indifferent tone, as though answering a mundane question, "I'm just waiting for my dad. He said he'd be back soon, and when he's ready, I'll go home." Her demeanor left the officers puzzled and uneasy. They couldn't ignore the peculiar tranquility in her voice and behavior. Despite the tension of the situation, the young woman seemed completely unfazed by their presence. However, her lack of cooperation only deepened the officers' sense that there was more to this incident than met the eye. They repeatedly instructed her to exit the vehicle, but each time, she responded with mild explanations, her tone devoid of worry, as if this were all just a harmless game. The officers began to sense that something was amiss. This was no ordinary individual. Perhaps she was grappling with some psychological issues, or perhaps there were deeper reasons beyond their immediate understanding. The atmosphere seemed to constrict around them, caught in the standoff between the police's persistence and her detached demeanor, creating a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The initial gentle persuasion of the officers gradually gave way to sharper tones, but the woman remained steadfast, as though, in her mind, this was nothing more than a routine wait. The situation took an unexpected turn when the young woman's father arrived. Yet, his presence did little to resolve the issue. Instead, it added layers of complexity to the unfolding drama. Her father, an elderly man, sat hunched in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His gaze seemed distant, lost in a world of fragmented thoughts. Deep wrinkles lined his face, bearing the weight of years and the burdens of life. He exhaled heavily, as if wrestling with elusive memories and thoughts that refused to coalesce into clarity. When he finally spoke, his voice was frail, as though the words he meant to say had been stuck in his throat. "I just wanted to take her home, but I can't seem to remember where we were headed," he muttered, his voice like a whisper lost in the fog, uncertain and adrift. The officers' expressions shifted from curiosity to concern. They exchanged glances before focusing on the man before them. A growing unease crept into their hearts as they observed the clear signs of disorientation in his behavior. Though he was attempting something as simple as driving his daughter somewhere, his actions indicated he was struggling with a serious problem. Everything seemed off. He couldn't remember their destination, had inexplicably stopped the car, and was unable to provide a coherent explanation. His words were fragmented, as if pieced together from scattered shards of memory, like someone trying to recall the past but unable to find the final piece of the puzzle. The officers recognized the hallmarks of dementia, a condition that increasingly afflicts the elderly, robbing them of control over their thoughts and actions. The man's confusion, from forgetting his location to abruptly stopping the car, set off alarms. His every action was a clear indication of deteriorating mental faculties, raising concerns for both his safety and that of others around him. The police, maintaining their composure, quickly grasped the gravity of the situation. Yet, a sense of helplessness lingered. Here was a father trying to do something simple, yet betrayed by his own faltering memory. The signs of dementia, subtle but undeniable, were like an approaching storm they could not prevent. That sense of futility hung in the air as the father's disjointed actions and uncertain grasp of reality left everyone feeling lost in a labyrinth of complications. Meanwhile, the young woman remained seated in the car, her expression calm and unaffected by the police's presence. She sat there quietly, her cold gaze fixed on the window as if everything happening around her were irrelevant. Her hands rested on the seat, unmoving, her breathing steady, as the officers' voices filled the tense silence around her. "My father has memory issues," she stated firmly, her voice unwavering, her eyes still fixed on the outside view. "He just wants me to stay here, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just waiting for him to come back so we can go home." Her words sounded resolute, as if explaining a perfectly rational situation, yet there was an underlying ambiguity, as though she were convincing herself that everything was fine. She showed no signs of fear in the presence of law enforcement, continuing to sit motionless, as if waiting for something, or perhaps contemplating thoughts too distant to articulate. The officers, exercising patience, continued to explain the situation calmly, trying to clarify things. "But this car belongs to your father," one officer said, his tone serious. "He has no obligation to take you home if he doesn't want to." Despite their efforts, the woman did not immediately respond. A long silence enveloped the scene, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind brushing against the car windows. The girl, although hearing every word the police said, showed no reaction. Instead of responding, she simply gazed out the window, her eyes blank, as if lost in a separate world. Her face was expressionless, like a wooden plank drifting aimlessly on the sea. In those moments, it seemed she was facing an internal battle no one could comprehend. Her gaze sparkled with something unexplainable, perhaps the struggle of distant memories or merely a cold silence resisting everything happening around her. The police, after a while, sensed the tension escalating. They realized that continuing to explain or persuade might be futile. Yet none of them dared to act hastily, fearing that any wrong move could escalate the situation into an uncontrollable confrontation. The girl remained still, like a cold, immovable stone, unresponsive. The atmosphere froze in a tense silence, giving everyone the sense that the situation could unfold unpredictably at any moment. The tension grew heavier with each passing minute as the police stood in front of the car, the vehicle's lights circling in the dark like relentless flashes of lightning. They were forced to demand the girl exit the car, their voices sharp, clear, and decisive. "If you don't cooperate, we will have to take stronger measures." The eerie silence enveloped the scene, yet their words seemed to cut through it like a blade, challenging the girl's resolve. She showed no intention of yielding. Her eyes, wide open and devoid of fear, reflected the unease of those standing before her. Shaking her head without hesitation, her lips tightened before finally releasing words filled with defiance. "I've done nothing wrong. I don't have to leave until my father is ready." Her voice carried an unwavering conviction, as though she had steeled herself for a fight she had no intention of losing. While claiming she didn't want trouble, her words revealed a resolute stance. Each phrase was like a wall, each motion intensified the tension in the air. "I'm just waiting for my father," she continued, but her tone lacked the softness it once had. In truth, her attitude was nothing short of a challenge to those before her, as though she were declaring war on authority. The police exchanged glances, their eyes filled with both concern and determination. They understood this was no mere minor offense. They weren't just confronting a young woman but facing a clash between logic and emotion, between the rule of law and the deep, unspoken turmoil within her. The girl refused to relent, while the officers had run out of patience. Every word they spoke, every move she made, could ignite an unpredictable explosion. Time seemed to stand still, a silent battle waged without weapons, yet brimming with tension and fear. The dialogue between the police and the girl grew increasingly fraught, as the situation expanded beyond a simple matter of vehicle possession. All eyes turned to the father, an elderly man whose indecisive demeanor betrayed signs of cognitive decline, possibly the onset of dementia. The police realized the odd behavior of the father wasn't merely stubbornness but a clear indication of deteriorating mental health. The girl, steadfast in her refusal to leave the car, insisted her father had brought her there, and she was simply waiting for his decision on when to leave. The officers grew increasingly uneasy, understanding that any misstep could worsen the situation. If the father's mental state was indeed compromised, his decisions might no longer be reliable. Forcing the daughter out of the car in this context could have unforeseen consequences. The officers began to grasp the gravity of the situation. This was not a straightforward issue of property rights. It was a complex scenario where the health and safety of everyone involved were at stake. The girl, while feeling unfairly treated, was grappling with her own burden, caring for a father in declining health while navigating the confrontation with the police. In this tense atmosphere, the police recognized that swift and decisive action was necessary to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. The girl might continue arguing or even escalate her resistance, complicating matters further. This was no longer about simply asking someone to exit a vehicle. It was a collision of rationality and emotion, rights and mental health. Mishandling the situation could lead to serious repercussions, affecting the father, the daughter, and the officers themselves. With every passing moment, the weight of the decision bore down more heavily on the officers. They knew their actions had to tread a delicate line, where even a minor mistake could irreversibly alter the lives of those involved. They weren't just resolving a situation, they were safeguarding the rights and safety of everyone, the stubborn daughter, the ailing father, and themselves in this fraught confrontation. As the clock struck 12:30 a.m., with the stillness of the night thick around them, the standoff between the girl and the officers continued to escalate, pushing the situation toward the brink of chaos. The girl, sitting motionless in the car, stared unflinchingly at the officers, her face tight with tension and confusion. The officers, striving to maintain calm, couldn't hide the fatigue and concern etched into their expressions. Everything felt tangled, like a knotted rope impossible to unravel. "We just need you to step out of the car," one officer finally spoke, his voice firm but laced with understanding. Yet these words only heightened the girl's tension. She took a deep breath, her hands clutching the car door handle as if it were her last connection to reality. "I don't want to leave," she replied, her voice resolute. "My father is having memory issues, and I just want to go home." The officers exchanged worried looks, their expressions a mixture of empathy and unyielding commitment to upholding the law. They knew this situation wasn't as simple as a routine call. Beneath it lay a complicated family story, a daughter grappling with the fear of losing the father she once knew, while being unable to escape the shadow of a broken family. Each second dragged on interminably, breaths from both sides mingling, neither willing to back down. The girl, her eyes red from sleeplessness and worry, murmured, "I just need a little time, some space to figure out what to do next." But the officers couldn't stand idly by any longer. They had warned her that if she didn't step out, they would have to escalate their actions. One officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're trespassing, and if you don't leave, we'll have to arrest you." At this, the girl turned to her father, a silent man sitting in the car, his face distant and unfamiliar. "Dad," she whispered, "help me," but there was no response. He simply sat there, his eyes seemingly blind to her, lost in a world of his own. The suffocating atmosphere intensified the drama. The officers prepared to approach the girl, their hands ready to physically remove her from the car. A tense silence blanketed the scene until a decisive move was made. The girl reacted strongly, refusing to let the situation spiral further. She cried out, not from fear but from the despair boiling over inside her. "Don't touch me! Don't pull me out!" She struggled, limbs flailing as she tried to fend off the hands gripping her. But the inevitable unfolded. The officers, left with no alternative, used force to remove her from the car. Her screams pierced the quiet night, filled with anger and pain. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not a criminal." Her cries were like pleas into the darkness, but no one could change the course of what was about to happen. This confrontation was not merely a clash between the girl and the police, but a battle between anxiety, anguish, and the fear of a family falling apart. The officers had tried to reason with her, but her refusal to accept the circumstances left no room for compromise, while she herself couldn't face the reality that her father might no longer be the man she once knew. The police stood outside the car, their determined gaze fixed on the girl stubbornly sitting inside. The girl, resolute, avoided their eyes, staring out the window as though trying to escape their judgment. Each movement of hers exuded defiance. Despite their efforts to maintain composure, the tension in the officers' postures betrayed their unease. A heavy silence hung in the air, each passing second dragging out the suspense like a thread stretched to its breaking point. Outside, the sound of wind rustled through the trees, but the space felt cut off from the noise, leaving only the sighs of the law enforcement officers whose eyes stayed fixed on the girl. Each passing second confronted them with a tougher decision, whether to take one more step in persuading her to come out or to escalate with stronger measures to resolve the situation. The girl remained seated in the car, her gaze distant and unflinching. Her fingers clutched the armrest tightly, but there was no trace of fear or anxiety. Her eyes seemed to search for an escape, but not from the car. In her world, the vehicle appeared to be the only refuge shielding her from whatever lay beyond. Then, a police officer's voice broke the tense silence, firm, yet tinged with urgency. "You need to come out, or we'll have no choice but to take stronger action." The words rippled through the taut atmosphere, tightening the tension. The girl didn't respond. She merely turned slightly, her defiant gaze fixed on the window. Time crawled, each moment feeling like fate's slow march forward, and a sense of futility began to settle over everyone present. Everything felt like it was reaching a breaking point, like a taut rope about to snap. "You need to step out of the car," one of the officers said firmly, his eyes never leaving the young woman seated inside. "This is your father's property. If he doesn't want to drive, you can't just stay in here like this." His voice carried authority, cutting through any potential resistance. Still, the girl remained motionless, her cold stare locked on the window as if oblivious to the warning. Moments of silence dragged on, amplifying the weight of the situation. The father standing nearby was visibly losing patience, his gaze betraying a hint of helplessness as he looked at his daughter. His attempts at explanation were incoherent, only adding complexity to the situation. "Do you even hear what I'm saying?" the officer pressed, his tone steady but with waning patience. Another officer stepped closer, his expression stern and seemingly ready to proceed. "If you don't step out of the car now, we'll be forced to intervene more assertively." The already heavy tension seemed to shatter when the girl finally spoke. Yet, her words weren't outright defiance. They carried doubt and frustration instead. "He's not someone I can just leave behind. Don't you understand? He's not himself anymore." Her statement struck like a chord vibrating through everyone's strained patience. The tension wasn't merely rooted in her actions, but also in the complex familial struggles she was clearly grappling with. The exchange had become more than a standoff between the girl and the officers. It was an outward reflection of the inner turmoil she couldn't escape. "You can't stay here forever," the officer insisted, his patience now replaced with visible disappointment. "If you don't cooperate, this situation will escalate beyond what you can imagine." His voice grew sharper, heightening the oppressive atmosphere. Onlookers seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her next move. Would she comply, or would she push the situation to its limits, forcing actions no one wanted to take? The officers stepped closer, readying themselves for more decisive measures. Yet, the girl remained seated, her face betraying no clear emotion, her eyes glued to the window as though everything around her was a blurred scene she no longer wished to participate in. Finally, she tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her body rigid, her eyes staring into the distance. After a pause, she spoke again, her voice slow and resolute, tinged with both stubbornness and vulnerability. "He doesn't need to drive me home. If he doesn't want to, then there's nothing I can do." She didn't look at the officers, instead focusing on an unseen point ahead as if shielding her unease. Her gaze was cold, but her tone betrayed weariness and unmistakable disappointment. This wasn't the first time she'd endured such futile confrontations or engaged in negotiations that went nowhere. "All I need is to sit here until he's ready," she added, her words like icy stones dropping into the thick tension, underscoring her defiance. The officers stood firm, but even they couldn't miss the girl's unshakable resolve. The air inside the car grew heavy. Despite repeated warnings, she showed no fear or hesitation. Perhaps, to her, the car was the last remaining place where she could feel secure, even if it was merely a vehicle parked by the roadside. "But do you understand?" Another officer stepped forward, his tone firm but tempered with patience. "You have no right to stay in this car if your father doesn't want you here. This is his property, and we're within our rights to ask you to leave." The girl stayed silent, narrowing her eyes and pressing her lips tightly together. She avoided eye contact with the officer, lowering her gaze instead. Her fingers gripped the edge of the seat, as though the car was her only anchor in an unsteady world. She couldn't allow herself to give up, not to these officers, not to anyone, not yet. "This is my father's car," she murmured, her voice quivering with restrained emotion. "He brought me here. I just need a little more time." "We understand you might be having difficulties," the officer replied, his tone calm but firm. "But you have to understand that if he doesn't want to drive you, you can't force him. If you stay in the car against his will, you're trespassing. This isn't a place you can remain." A suffocating silence followed, stretching for what felt like an eternity. Everyone's eyes were on the girl, curled up in the car. The officers were doing their best to stay composed, but their patience was wearing thin. Meanwhile, the girl's gaze grew unfocused, lost in thought, her expression a mix of confusion and despair. "We don't want to use force," the officer added, his voice tense, "but if you continue to resist, we'll have no choice." The girl didn't respond immediately. She could only feel the cold air inside the car and the weight of the officer's warnings pressing down on her. The world outside seemed to shrink, and every exit seemed shut. She felt cornered, standing at a crossroads she couldn't control. "But I have nowhere else to go," she finally sighed, her voice nearly breaking. "He's all I have left." The officer looked at her, his expression no longer stern but still resolute. "You understand we're only doing our job, don't you? Nobody wants to push you into this situation, but if you don't comply, we have no other options." The silence that followed was even heavier, but this time it seemed to hold the weight of realization. The girl turned, her eyes finally meeting the officer's. They burned with defiance and determination, though her disheveled hair and tense face betrayed her exhaustion. She stood her ground, unyielding despite the pressure. Her voice, calm but sharp, cut through the stifling atmosphere like a blade. "I don't understand why this is necessary," she said, her tone steady and razor-like. "I'm just a daughter waiting for her father." Here is the translation into English. Her hands clenched tightly on the car seat, as if she wanted to hold onto the last bit of space left between herself and the chaotic world around her. Although she could sense the police officer's concern, her gaze remained unwavering, not once bowing her head. She was not just facing a law enforcement officer, but confronting an entire system she did not trust, an imposition she felt was unjust. She didn't just want freedom, she also wanted understanding and respect from those around her, especially those in positions of power. "I'm just a girl waiting for her father," she repeated firmly, but this time her voice became stronger, as if challenging every word. She didn't want to lose her rights, but neither did she want to be overwhelmed by a sense of weakness. She wanted everyone to understand that sometimes difficult situations don't have simple answers, and sometimes all it takes is a little patience and understanding. But perhaps not everyone was willing to listen to what she had to say. The police officer stood there, like an immovable wall, but his gaze began to drift, as if he was trying to understand a story he could not grasp. Had he begun to realize that beneath the tough and stubborn exterior, this girl was simply waiting for an old, ailing father, or was he still seeing her as a violator that needed to be dealt with? That question hung in the air, unanswered for the moment. At that moment, the father, his face full of exhaustion and disappointment, stood to one side, his trembling hand gripping the car door as if searching for support, before finally speaking. His voice was hoarse, carrying the sadness and helplessness of a father who didn't know how to help his child. "I've done everything I could," he began, his eyes flicking to the officers and then back to the girl in the car. "I bought her a gift card, just so she'd have something to spend, because she doesn't have a job. I drove her here, thinking she might eat something, get her spirits up." He paused, swallowing hard, then continued, his voice cracking like someone exhausted after months of effort. "I want the best for her, I want her to be stable, but look." He pointed at the car, where his daughter still sat, her eyes cold as if she didn't care about his pain. "She won't come out. She won't listen to me. I don't know what to do anymore." As soon as he finished speaking, the air seemed to freeze for a moment. The officers exchanged glances, while the girl slumped back in the seat, her arms crossed defiantly, clearly expressing her refusal to cooperate. She looked at him with a challenging gaze, a half-smile on her lips, as if to say, "What will you do about it?" The father stepped back, as if pushed into an invisible corner. The flashing lights from the police car reflected on his weary face, highlighting the lines of fatigue and aging. For a moment, it seemed as if he wanted to scream, to shake his daughter out of the stubborn shell she had built around herself. But instead, he only let out a long sigh, as if it drained the last of his energy. "I just want to be her father, but it seems like that's not enough now," he whispered, as though speaking to himself, his eyes red as he looked down at the ground. The officers watched him closely, their gazes filled with empathy but still unmistakably firm. One of them spoke up, his voice calm but resolute. "Sir, we understand that this situation is not easy for you. You've done a lot to help your daughter. But now, for the sake of everyone's safety, you absolutely have the right to ask her to get out of the car." The officer's words cut through the tense air like a sharp blade. The father lowered his head slightly, his hand trembling as if weighing a difficult decision. He glanced at the car where his daughter still sat, her gaze defiant, her lips pressed tight as if to assert she would not give in. The officer continued, his tone softening a little, but still unwavering, "You've tried your best to help her, we see that. But her stubbornness is making everything worse. If you don't act now, this situation could spiral out of control." The father sighed, his eyes filled with the weariness of someone who had hoped and been disappointed too many times. He remembered the days when his daughter was small, her bright eyes, her innocent smile, and he wondered how everything had come to this. But now, sitting in front of him was a stranger, someone he no longer knew how to reach. "My daughter, she's not okay," he said, his voice hoarse as though each word was a burden he had to push out of his chest. "I've tried, but it seems everything I do is wrong." The officer nodded, his gaze never leaving him. "We understand, sir. But now is the time for you to be strong. Sometimes helping isn't about continuing to pamper her, but setting boundaries." The air seemed to thicken, the only sound the soft rustling of wind through the car window. From inside the car, the girl's eyes flashed with anger, like a flame smoldering quietly. But the officers were prepared for every scenario. Their voices, though sympathetic, were firm, a declaration that could not be negotiated. Their patience had run out. At that moment, the girl turned around, her eyes alight with a mixture of anger, pain, and despair. She stared directly at her father, her gaze as if trying to pierce through the aging shell of his exterior to find a glimmer of hope. "Dad, I can't get out," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I have nowhere to go. Don't you understand? I can't just walk out into the street not knowing where I'll end up, without a place to live. I can't do it." Each word she spoke was like a knife cutting through the heavy silence. Meanwhile, the father remained silent, his face frozen. It was unclear whether it was from the hurt or because he didn't know how to respond. But his silence only made her more desperate. "Do you think I want this?" she burst out, her voice cracking. "I don't have a job, I don't have money, I have no one to help me. You're the only one left, but now you're pushing me out of the car, as if I'm no longer your daughter." Her words were sharp, as if trying to cling to the last bit of compassion her father might have left. The father stood still, his hands trembling as he gripped the car keys. He turned his face away, avoiding her piercing gaze. "Dad, I can't do anything more," he muttered, his voice hollow, as if even he didn't believe the words he had just said. The atmosphere inside the car felt suffocating. The exchange was no longer a conversation, but a violent clash of two souls wounded and trapped in a cycle of helplessness and pain. The officers stood outside, witnessing the rising drama, unable to intervene immediately. A situation that seemed simple had now turned into an unsolvable mess. After a long period of trying to remain calm, the officers had lost their patience. One of them, his gaze sharp like a knife, stepped closer to the car door, bent down, and spoke with authority but firmness. "You listen here, it's time to stop this game. You need to get out of the car immediately. This is your father's property, and he has the right to request this. If you continue to refuse, we have no other choice but to take strong action to resolve this. Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" The air seemed to freeze around them, every word from the officer heavier than the stifling atmosphere of the night. The patrol car lights reflected off the window, casting blinding streaks of light, accompanied by the clatter of the communication device. Tension reached its peak as the girl, curled up in the corner of the seat, did not respond immediately. She turned her face away, staring intently into the dark distance, her lips pressed tight as if trying to swallow any remaining objections. Her defiant attitude was like a smoldering fire, challenging the patience of the law enforcement officers. But they did not stop. The officer's stern voice rang out once more, like a final warning. "This is your last chance. You have a choice. But if you continue to resist, this situation will not end easily. Get out of the car now, or we will take action." The silence that followed felt suffocating. It was a moment where everyone knew that even the slightest movement could trigger a chain of irreversible events. A decision had to be made, and it would determine everything. Every word from the police fell like heavy raindrops in a quiet room, each sound carrying the weight of an unspoken sentence. The tension seemed to cling to the air, making every breath a struggle. The girl, with her defiant gaze, sat motionless like a statue of stubbornness. She didn't respond, only repeating weak arguments as her last shield, defending what she believed was her right. On the other side, the father stood silently, his frail shoulders trembling with each sigh. His eyes, full of wrinkles and fatigue, wavered between helplessness and pain. He couldn't say anything more, couldn't do anything more, like a man who had lost control in front of his own child. Despite his love and responsibility, he felt trapped in a family tragedy with no way out. The police approached, their voices becoming firmer, but the girl remained unmoved, as if any movement would be surrender. This confrontation wasn't just between her and the law, it was a long-lasting internal battle, between hurt and pride, between a child's responsibility and a father's burden. Everything was pushed to the brink, as silence became heavier than words, a reminder that sometimes the most painful thing is that none of us truly know what to do. With no other choice, the police began to prepare stronger measures. "If you don't get out, we will intervene," one of them said, his tone full of determination. The situation grew more dramatic, the tension so palpable that everyone could feel the fatigue in the air. Who would win this confrontation? As the tension continued to rise, the girl stubbornly refused to leave her father's car, despite the police's advice. She sat firmly in her seat, her eyes fixed on the window, as if hoping for a miracle. Sensing that the situation was slipping out of control, the police started changing tactics. One of them approached more closely, his voice growing more severe. "You need to get out immediately. This isn't your car, and you don't have the right to stay here without the owner's permission." The girl remained unfazed, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her lips trembling but still resolute. "He is my father. I won't leave until he tells me I can go." Time seemed to stop, and the air grew suffocating. Another officer approached, his tone now taut with tension. "Do you understand that if you don't get out, we'll have to use force?" The girl suddenly laughed, a laugh filled with rage and despair, then shouted, "You have no right to treat me like this. I didn't do anything wrong. You are attacking me." Her outcry wasn't just resistance, it was the scream of someone trapped in despair. She began crying, tears betraying her anger and sense of violation. "Who do you think you are? What do you intend to do to me? Keep going, I'll sue you for assault and abuse." Each word she spoke was a warning, but the police's resolve didn't waver. And then, everything exploded. The police, no longer patient, began to act. They yanked the door open, trying to force it. The girl struggled, her hands gripping the seat, her body contorting to hold her ground. "No. I'm not going anywhere," she screamed. One officer quickly grabbed her hand and yanked, nearly pulling her out of the seat. The struggle within the cramped space of the car only heightened the tension. She could no longer keep her composure. The shouting, the resistance, all merged into a chaotic storm that everyone around could feel. She punched at the officer's hand, trying to break free, only making things worse. A weary sigh came from the head of the team, stating what the girl didn't want to face. "You will be arrested for resisting an officer if you don't cooperate." Despite the warnings, her resistance grew stronger, forcing the police to take more aggressive measures. They tried to subdue her, but she kept struggling, kicking at their legs, shouting, "What are you doing to me? Don't touch me!" Meanwhile, the father could only stand outside, helpless, not daring to intervene. The police maintained their hold on her, trying to subdue and control the situation. Even as the girl fought, they had no choice but to continue their duty. One of them spoke firmly, "We don't want to do this, but you've left us no choice. Please be quiet and come with us." But the girl gritted her teeth and refused to listen. The situation escalated to the point of no return. Her resistance, though strong, couldn't match the force of the police. She was pulled out of the car, the officers' firm actions forcing her into submission, but the struggle didn't end. She continued to scream, continued to resist, and it seemed everything had gone past the point of control. The police could only follow procedure, but the girl felt cornered. Everything ended in suffocating tension when the girl was finally arrested. Yet the question still hung in the air. Did all these actions really solve the problem, or just make everything more complicated and painful? Unresolved situation. Despite the police and the girl's attempts to explain, the tension only increased. The girl remained firm in her refusal to leave the car, even though the police clearly explained her father's ownership rights and the legal consequences if she didn't cooperate. Her stubbornness was like an unquenchable flame, making the situation harder to resolve. The police, though patient and soft-spoken at first, had no choice but to resort to more forceful measures. They demanded she leave the car, but each time she resisted, increasing the tension. Her repeated shouts of, "I won't leave the car," echoed in the space like an unanswered challenge. Everything was spiraling out of control, and the police's patience was wearing thin. No agreement reached. Even though the father tried to explain that he just wanted to take her home, that his health no longer allowed him to do anything else, and he only wanted her to leave the car to resolve the matter, the girl couldn't listen. She only thought of herself, believing that being abandoned by her father once again was too cruel, and that living in the car was her only choice. The police's warnings were like water off a duck's back, unable to change her mind. In the midst of all this tension, the father could only continue worrying. He stood there, looking at his daughter, his eyes clouded, as if he didn't recognize himself in his actions. Though he knew he might face a conflict, he only wanted the situation to end peacefully. At that moment, the girl turned around, her eyes shining with determination. "What are you going to do to me?" she shouted, causing those around her to quiet down, the air thick with tension. The police, seemingly with no other choice, began to take more aggressive actions, and the situation became increasingly unmanageable. Despite the explanations, no one seemed to understand, and no one was willing to yield. The story is not just a legal situation between the police and a daughter trying to defend her rights. It is also a clear reflection of the complex relationship between a father and daughter, especially when mental health issues are involved. The father, once the pillar of the family, is now facing memory issues, which may be signs of dementia or cognitive decline. This not only makes him weak, unable to make clear decisions, but it also creates an invisible distance between him and his daughter. The daughter, in the face of this change, may be struggling with feelings of loss and disappointment, unable to perceive her father the way she once did. She is not only the daughter of a father who is gradually losing his mental clarity, but also someone who must bear the responsibility of caring for him, a heavy emotional and psychological burden that is hard to fully describe. This story deeply reflects the changes in family relationships when a member's mental health is compromised, and serves as a reminder of the importance of mental health care for those facing illness. In such complex situations, understanding and patience are crucial. Both the daughter and her father are going through difficult emotions, and without empathy from others, the situation will only become more tense. The daughter, in her state of stress and anxiety, may not fully understand her father's actual issues, causing her to resist fiercely when asked to leave the car. However, if she could recognize and understand that her father's behavioral changes are part of a mental health issue, things might have played out differently. The police, while carrying out their duty, also need to show patience and understanding of the situation, rather than just focusing on enforcement. Understanding and empathy would help reduce conflict rather than leading to unnecessary violent actions. Patience, instead of rigidity, not only helps resolve the situation but also fosters connection and assists others during difficult times. The story also highlights the role of the police in complex family situations, where legal matters are intertwined with personal emotions. While the police may be called to such situations with the sole purpose of maintaining order, they are often confronted with a range of emotional factors and special circumstances, making resolution much more difficult. When dealing with situations involving mental health and complex family issues, the police need to not only apply the law accurately but also be flexible and understanding in handling the situation appropriately. Instead of rigidly following legal procedures, they must assess all factors carefully, including health, emotions, and the circumstances of each individual. Especially in such cases, if the police lack understanding, their actions can escalate unnecessarily, making things worse. Therefore, the role of the police is not just to maintain order, but also to coordinate and resolve situations with subtlety and reasoning, particularly when dealing with families with mental health concerns. This story serves as a profound lesson on the necessity of combining emotional elements, understanding, and responsibility in all difficult situations, especially when there is intervention from authorities. This story provides a powerful and poignant reminder of the crucial importance of integrating emotional intelligence, empathy, and a sense of responsibility in the resolution of complex and difficult situations. It underscores the delicate balance between upholding the law and understanding the human factors that influence the decisions and actions of those involved. In circumstances where authorities are called to intervene, particularly when mental health or family dynamics are in play, it becomes even more essential to approach the situation with sensitivity and awareness. The story highlights how legal actions alone are often insufficient in addressing the deeper emotional and psychological needs of individuals caught in distressing circumstances. When authorities step into the lives of people already dealing with personal turmoil, the manner in which they respond can either escalate or de-escalate a situation. The officers in the story are faced not only with enforcing the law but also with the responsibility to understand the underlying struggles of those involved, particularly when mental health issues are at play. Their actions, while rooted in the need to maintain order, must also consider the emotional toll on individuals like the daughter and father. The narrative demonstrates that without an empathetic approach, even the best-intentioned interventions can result in harm or misunderstandings. The daughter, caught in her own emotional turmoil, may not be able to fully grasp the implications of her father's mental decline. Similarly, her father, though the one most directly affected by his mental state, becomes a figure of helplessness in the face of both his condition and his daughter's resistance. The lack of clear communication and the failure to address the emotional components of the situation lead to a breakdown in understanding and exacerbate the tension. This situation exemplifies that it is not enough to simply follow procedures or enforce authority. What is equally important is to recognize the emotional undercurrents, the individual fears, and the relationships that are in turmoil. Authorities must engage with these elements, showing patience and compassion to ensure that their actions do not cause unnecessary harm, but rather work toward a solution that respects the dignity and needs of everyone involved. In many ways, the story calls for a shift in how we think about interventions by the state, moving beyond mere enforcement of the law to a more nuanced and humane approach that considers the broader emotional and psychological context of each situation. Thus, this story becomes more than just a depiction of a legal encounter. It is a reflection on the necessity of approaching difficult situations with a combination of law, compassion, and a deep understanding of human emotion. Whether in family disputes, mental health crises, or any other complex personal challenges, the role of authorities should not only be about ensuring compliance but also about offering support and finding paths that address the deeper issues at play. The lesson here is one of balance, between justice and empathy, responsibility and care. Only through this balanced approach can we hope to resolve difficult situations in ways that heal rather than harm.